17 minutes past 6 Central African time. Let's get into this section of the show that we call the Roundup Wrap. And we invite our resident analyst, Mighti Jamie, to talk to us about some of the stories highlighted earlier in the week, as well as throw forward to the week ahead as we start this new day and new week. It's Monday. A happy Monday to you, Jamie. How are you?
Morning to you, morning to the viewers. Happy Monday to you too.
Well, let's get straight into it and catch up in terms of what happened last week over the weekend and what we can expect to develop in this new week. And we talk of Tanzania. The country is launching now an inquiry into last month's post-election violence. President Samia Suluhu Hassan has told Parliament, she said this on Friday. Of course, we were all waiting to hear what she will respond and say in terms of what we've all been speaking about. Opposition parties are saying hundreds were killed during protests after the 29th October vote, and though the government has not released an official toll, how do you see this one panning out? Because there's so many differing accounts in terms of how many people have died, even if we start there.
Yeah, so you're right. Everyone was looking to see how she was going to respond and how the government of Tanzania was going to respond. So she made some announcements which were a little bit worrying if you think about them in a constitutional perspective. But let's discuss what actually they're doing. So, number one, they're trying to do crisis management. They saw and appreciated that the global community, the African community, investors were very perturbed and troubled by everything that happened in the last few weeks and months, even that democracy is not well in Tanzania. Tanzania does rely a lot on tourist support. They do have a very healthy tourism sector. And of course, on the international stage, having a pariah reputation or a reputation which is anti-democratic can affect you when you're looking for loans, looking for partnerships. And certain businesses and companies are value-based and they wouldn't want to associate themselves with an autocratic regime. So the first thing is that it was crisis management and some type of PR balancing. What was worrying is that she was saying things to the director of public prosecutions and to prosecutors that they must show leniency. She was quoting the Bible saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, and if you think about the context of that constitutionally, she is effectively indicating that she can tamper with prosecutions, she can tamper with the appetite of prosecutors to get convictions, and she can also tamper with what kind of a conviction they do get. And when you take that together, that suggests that there is no independent judiciary and that the executive has control over the judiciary in a manner that should concern us because you want there to be separation of powers, not consolidation of powers, not dictation of what should be done by the regime. So that's something that I thought was democratically concerning. When it comes to the human rights violations and the loss of life, I think that it's going to be important for international bodies to make verifications of this because this data cannot be lost, it cannot be downsized, it cannot be diminished. The opposition voices have said that about 1,000 or over 1,000 people were killed. That's a significant number in and of itself. The other international reporting outlets are saying hundreds of people have been killed. There's a bit of a discrepancy. Is it hundreds? Is it over 1,000? Is it thousands? And that's something that has to be ascertained because it will let us know what is the full extent of the human rights violations that have been conducted, not only the deaths, but also the injuries, also if there's been any types of sexual assaults and anything that may have been done by the military, by the police, which is against human rights, which is against the African Charter on Rights and also the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance. Already we've seen that there were issues around the elections themselves from the AU Election Observer Mission report and the SADC Election Observer Mission report. But it's going to be important for accountability for us to get a determination of how many people were actually, killed, how many were injured, whose rights were violated so that they can get, accountability for the people who did it, as well as redress in terms of restoring their families to some kind of position which makes them whole. And these things are going to be important to pay attention to. So I think we need to get Amnesty International, their Human Rights Watch, their, Doctors Without Borders, the kind of entities that can then be able to ascertain what really has happened. But as for the official response, it's a lot of damage control and a lot of trying to walk back what they've done. But we must still not forget that the position currently right now in Tanzania is that the current regime is leading without full legitimacy. And that's the bottom line.
She refers to protesters or those who took action as people who had fallen under peer pressure. What do you make of that statement? And she says she forgives those who protested because they were falling under peer pressure to take this action. Is it not an insult to the intelligence of the Tanzanian people and somehow watering down what their cause was?
It is a watering down. It is a, it's treating adults like children, because what has happened here is that many young Africans across Africa have come to realize that the current regimes, which are gerontocratic in nature, all of these 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds, 80-year-olds running institutions, are not helping them. And they're trying to actually now take a stand for themselves and fight for the future that they think they deserve. So to just be told that, no, it's peer pressure, you just saw things on TikTok, you were trying to be cool, it is a reduction of the democratic moment for them and their civil rights struggle, if you will, their human rights struggle, their democratic struggle. And I think it was something that we should refuse as messaging to acknowledge and give credit to, because that is simply juniorization of large parts of the population, which is shameful, to be quite honest, everything that has happened in Tanzania. And also now that the AU and SADC have said that these elections were not free and fair, in effect we need them to now take a strong stance. They've taken strong stances against countries where there have been coups. We saw how they were responding to, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. They need to show us that same approach, that same energy level when it comes to what's happened in Tanzania, because your observers cannot say that people were being given multiple ballots and then you come back and then act as if it's business as usual. It is not business as usual.
Right, in Benin now, let's talk about that country. They are approving a constitutional amendment and this creating a second parliamentary chamber and extending presidential and legislative terms from 5 to 7 years. The current president, Patrice Talon, is going to be leaving in about 7 months, so I guess he's not that much affected by this. But how do you see this in terms of how it will either contribute or negate the political landscape and democratic processes of Benin?
It's a good question. And I think the first thing that we have to be mindful of that has been happening across Africa is that there's a trend now by regimes to try to extend their time in office through extending the term of office itself. I think we've seen a lot of countries adopt this 7-year term of office, which is basically trying to massage a third term to that period. Because if you think of the previous terms of office, which were popular as 5 years, other countries are even on 4 years. But let's look at the African trend of 5 years. So it's 5 years, 5 years, 10. Now they've got this 7-year thing, which basically takes it to 14 years and almost 3 terms on the old model where you had 15 years. So, yes, it's true that the current president looks like he's not going to benefit. But that doesn't negate the politics that may play out in the coming months, because you may find that this is just the first strategy on a route to try to create another political anomaly where he then becomes the first benefactor of this extended term limit. We've seen across various African countries when certain changes are made, there's always this argument that calm down, don't worry, it's not going to benefit the current guy. And then, before you know it, the current guy is now making a claim to the very same constitutional provisions, but saying, but why am I excluded? Or his supporters then coming back to say, why am I excluded? There was a time when we were hearing that Emerson Mnangagwa would not pursue a third term, for example, in Zimbabwe. And now we're hearing that he must govern Zimbabwe until 2030, which takes him beyond a second term. So if you think about those kind of dynamics and the kinds of regimes which make these types of changes, these are things that are quite concerning as and when they happen. And I think in as much as it looks like he won't benefit, we have to keep an eye on this.
Another story we need to keep an eye on as South Africans is the dozens of Palestinians who arrived in the country on a chartered flight. And our President, Cyril Ramaphosa, saying on Friday that they will not be turned away. About 153 Palestinians, mostly from Gaza, landed at OR Tambo. There were challenges there, some controversies, but what do you make of the South African government's handling of this situation?
Well, I'll say this in the first instance is that I think that the handling and the communication was bad. There are protocols that exist already for when people arrive as refugees, when they arrive as asylum seekers, and those protocols do not appear to have been followed because the group in question were Palestinians. And I think that is a problematic issue. And then the communications themselves also seemed to have been all over the place because this is something that should have been pre-briefed, something that the Department of International Relations should have been very sensitive to, and also the Department of Home Affairs should have been very sensitive to because this topic is a very sensitive issue, and we've seen that it has a lot of global voices. And the timing of this particular arrival just before the G20 makes it a political hot potato. But having said all of that, we must also keep in mind that anybody who says that they've got a legitimate fear of persecution and fears for their lives, or is coming from a space where they have a legitimate fear that they're not going to be able to live their lives, those people are entitled to apply for asylum anywhere in the world. Those are the international refugee laws, and that is also in the South African Refugee Act. So it doesn't look as if the Refugee Act was fully followed throughout this particular process. And that's something that I think everyone has to review and go back to the drawing board to make sure that when issues of this sensitive nature happen, they are dealt with appropriately. And it looks to me like it was what was supposed to be a normal refugee arrival, asylum seeker arrival, turned into, a brouhaha, as one president once said. And that's something that shouldn't have happened.
As you say, we're hosting the G20 this week as South Africa. To what extent do you think the country is prepared to host this gathering, especially given that the US is going to be absent?
I think the country is sufficiently prepared. All of the places where the delegates will be meeting have had events of this nature. Of course, there were concerns about the aesthetics of Johannesburg, traffic lights, potholes, those type of things can have a negative impression on people that you're trying to impress and attract as investors. So preparation, I would say, as ready as can be. Obviously, Johannesburg has challenges that Cape Town would not have as a result of the influxes and the corruption and the lack of service delivery. But it looks as if they've put up enough of a facade to pull this off in terms of the event. In terms of the impact, however, because America has taken such a hostile posture, because Xi Jinping is also not attending, even though he's sending a respectable delegation, that takes away some of the stature of the event. And now we're seeing that America is opposing a leader's declaration on the day or after the day. So that also will affect the impact. And now we're seeing that South African also are saying that they're not going to take or hand over and go to America to do a formal handover. All of those things mean that this event will have diminished status. But that's, I guess, something that the South African government can't do anything about at this point. It is what it is.
Right, and we also can't do anything about the storm that's predicted, but hopefully for the rest of the week, the skies will clear up.
Yeah. Let's hope that the weather is a little bit better. Otherwise, maybe the weather is a reflection of just the mess that is happening there at the G20 and in some parts of the country with all of this crime allegations that are unfolding.
Right. And we thank you again for your time. Always great having these catch up sessions on Mondays, Jamie. You have a great rest of the week. I'm sure you'll be speaking at some of the gatherings for the G20.
No. I'm staying far from that. The traffic is also bad. But I will be doing some interviews on readiness later on today on SABC. So at least I'll have that commentary going on and I'll be carrying my umbrella. So you do the same and have a good week too.
Thank you. Right. Mighty Jamie, our resident analyst who joins us on Mondays to give us our roundup wrap. 6:31 Central African time it is. Let's say good morning to Oneli Nzinzi for our news headlines.
SABC News.